Thank you very much. Great. This is going to be fun. We're going to have a really good time covering a lot of ground here, and it's good to be back. It really feels like a home in the Pacific Northwest to me. And with the ratings of best presentation, I think I should take myself out of the running. Once I won a grand prize of an iPad or something at a conference, I just felt too guilty. I had to give it back. But I think it should be for the track speakers, but that's my 2 cents. Anyway, okay, so while we're looking to get this going, and I'm going to walk and chew gum at the same time, I'm going to tell a little bit about what you will see. Back when I was first reporting on what we were seeing in terms of quality patterns on Agile, this was back in 2004, and it was one of the first keynote addresses on the subject. And people were complaining and resisting about saying that it was good for pond bridges, but it couldn't scale. So a lot of the initial case studies were, understandably, with smaller teams working in maybe like a prototyping fashion. And so the accusation by then, at that point, I think the big gorilla in the industry was the Carnegie Mellon Software Engineering Institute, if you remember. And even some of the critics that believed in the 5 levels of maturity were the ones that were the most vocal in speaking against that Agile could not scale. Well, looking at it now, we can obviously see that it is scaling. So part of what we're going to talk about today is not only what do we need to do in order to scale it, but what's the larger context about what if it does scale? You know, what do we do with it? You know, what's the whole point of being able to build systems that change the world? And if you can't execute at scale, then you're really not going to accomplish your mission, which is your outcome. And so I think that it really behooves us to be able to think about what we not only need to do as technologists in being able to stitch it together and have the various increments, program increments, and the various Agile pulse trains being able to deliver. But if, again, you're not delivering something that's really going to be making a difference and mattering in the world, then it's not really going to bring us the outcome that we seek to achieve. And if we're really thinking about ourselves as software professionals, about trying to achieve a certain outcome, we've got to be able to think about the outcomes that we're going to be applying our knowledge and our brains to, but also how do we execute well. So we're going to be talking a little bit about both. And the thing about executing is really also about thinking about stitching it together with the business side. So I'm going to be talking about what it takes in order to make the business agile. All right? Because we can be agile and we can drive systems that are able to deliver with a certain level of quality, but if our business isn't really targeting the things that are going to bring about effective outcomes and effective change, then we're really not in sync. We're out of sync. So that's where we're going on this road when we are successfully booted up, which we're getting to. So hang in there with me one more time. I hope that puts a little bit of context to what this talk is going to be about, because I think context matters. And in the big picture of things, I want to try to be able to paint that for you. So. Okay, let's start with the story. Anyone watch TV? You probably watch Discovery Channel. This is going to take us on an interesting turn, not on the road, but up in the air. There's a television show called Airplane Repo. Anyone see Airplane Repo? Okay, and you know what it's about. It's about a guy that goes in and steals jets of rich guys who are deadbeats and don't pay the bank for their Learjet payments, right? Okay, so I met this guy at a conference. He's on the left. His name is Mike Kennedy. Any pilots in the room? Aspiring pilots? A couple? Okay, cool. You don't have to be a pilot to listen to this talk. But anyway, Mike Kennedy was at this air show in Wisconsin, Oshkosh, 10,000 airplanes, 500,000 people. And I was wearing a conservation shirt, and he comes up to me and he says, "We have to talk." And I said, "Why?" And he said, "Because while I'm this television star on Airplane Repo, my real passion is conservation and rhino hunts and the extinction of elephants in Africa. So I fly aircraft to try to hunt the poachers." Now he, in the middle of his talk at this aviation conference on conservation, he introduced this guy on the right, and his name was C.C. Pocock. And he says, C.C. Pocock is the guy who was a bush pilot, African bush pilot, and taught me how to land a plane in 150 feet. because flying around and chasing poachers who are cutting off rhino horns for very strange reasons needs to be able to get in and out of fields that are very short. So I met this guy, C.C. Pocock, at the conference, and then I brought him to our little airfield to teach us about how do we land a plane at 150 feet. And there's a reason for this, because when you are able to do something like land an airplane, in that case 146 meters, because it takes a very specialty plane to be able to land in 150 feet. But I did it in the 1965 Piper Cherokee, which is my blue plane right there, which someday I'm going to take Phil flying in, and I promised him. But when you're able to do this, the way you get to it, as CC said, is you have to know the limits of your aircraft. You have to be able to really understand when you're at the edge and what you're doing. How are you going to fly it when it's on the edge of a stall? Now, if you're a pilot, you know a stall doesn't mean the engine quits. Stall means that you're going so slow that the airplane no longer is able to fly and starts to drop out of the sky. So can you fly an airplane at the edge of a stall and maneuver it and control it and not fall out of the sky? That's what we did. It's great fun. So he said to me, what we have to do is you have to write down the performance numbers of your aircraft. He said, do you know when your Blue Cherokee is about to fall out of the sky in terms of speed in knots or miles an hour? And I said, sure. You know, it's around 70, 80, 75. He said, but have you ever written it down? I don't mean just look in the manual. Actually go up in the sky, fly it at the edge until you fall out of the sky, and write down what your airspeed is at the moment before you start to fall out of the sky. I said, well, that sounds great. Let's do that. So we did it. And CC was writing down the numbers on his knee board for my plane's performance. Flaps power off, 0 flaps, 10 degrees, 50% with no power. When does the plane fall out of the sky? And then when does the plane fall out of the sky with full power, with the full flaps or no flaps? Okay, so now we know the edge of the envelope of our machine. And that's what allows you to be able to land a plane in 146 meters. So the reason why I bring that story up in context is because years ago, when we were first looking at Agile and whether it could scale, we started looking at data and writing things down for companies that were actually looking at driving down defects and shortening their time delivery, okay? So a lot of the criteria around whether it would be successful, in the words of Kent Beck, were, you know it's working if you can deliver more capability faster and with fewer bugs. And so that was the quality aspect of it. Now, Kent Beck, as you know, how many of you have followed Kent Beck's work? Pair programming, extreme programming. He's the author of a lot of the books on that. And so we went about to measure and write the numbers down about when we see the edge of the performance of the machine. So this is a guy named Mike Lunt, and he, at the time, was with BMC Software in Austin, Texas. And the company wanted to know what the edge of their speed was from a benchmarking perspective. So in my practice, one of the things I do is I have a very large worldwide database of projects collected globally. We have established trends and patterns for schedule, for how they're staffed, for the defects found during testing, defects right after delivery, and we have this reference database. So it's the Kelly Blue Book of software statistics. So we went into BMC Software and we captured some data, and it looked like this. So this was their Performance Manager release 2.3, and it started off in June with a story phase in green. It went starting in July with a very significant team of 7 parallel teams doing Scrum, and they went right out until the middle of the end of December, and they delivered a certain number of story points, 918 story points. During testing, they discovered about 635 bugs that had to be found and fixed, and it incorporated this much Java and XML in order to deliver those stories, so we could look at code density. How much code does it take for you to build a story and a story point? And we had the numbers. Now we wanted to know a couple of questions. We said, whoa, 93 people across 7 parallel Scrum teams. That's a big team. What's the industry average team size for that amount of functionality? It turned out it was more like 40. So whoa, so now we know you're trying to build this with over twice the headcount. When they finished in about 5.25 months, we said, wow, that's that much functionality in a 5-month time frame. What's the industry average delivery schedule for that kind of functionality, for that size backlog? And we found it was quite longer. I'm going to save the punchline for a minute. Here it is. So when you incorporate both the story phase or the requirements phase and the build phase for the outer reference of the world, it typically would take about 15 months to build that amount of functionality, and they were doing it in just over 6. Like, whoa, 6 months for something that normally takes well over a year and a quarter, and they're done in 6 months? The cost is about $5.2 million compared to an industry average cost of $5.5 million. Why? Why would they be less money if they're double the headcount? Because they're finishing in 6 months, right? Now, the key thing here were the defects found during QA. And when you double headcount to try to compress speed and compress schedule, do you think bugs go down or do they go up? They go up. Do you think they go up by more than double? What's your guess? If I double headcount, I go from 45 to 90. 3 to 4 times. You're actually right. Some people think, well, it goes up by at least double, but no, it goes up almost by the square of the team size increase, okay? Quick rule of thumb is that if you have a certain number of people on a team, say 8 people on a team compared to 4 people on a team, the number of communication paths is the number 8 times 1 less divided by 2. So 8 people on a team, for example, is 8 times 7 is 56. Divided by 2, it's 28. If you have 4 people on a team, it's 4 times 3, which is 12. Divided by 2, you get 6. So 6 to 28 is the kind of dramatic rise we see from a doubling in headcount. And now when you go from 40 to 80 or 90, now you're talking about a big deal. Now what did we see? We found that it didn't go up, which was very curious. And it didn't go up because of the practices that they were doing to scale Agile. And this was one of the first case studies that Dean Leffingwell was embarking on in experimenting with scaling Agile, in this case at BMC Software, that became the basis for SAFe 4.0. And when I looked at what the team did in terms of what's the backstory of what you're doing to make this happen, Mike Luntz said, well, you have to talk to Israel Gatt about that. Dr. Israel Gatt was the vice president. He had a very definitive vision on how to do this. And in his very thick Israeli accent, he said, well, you see, we have this secret sauce. Secret sauce? What are you talking about, secret sauce? You know, so more to come on that later. And some of that secret sauce you're going to find in the SAFe 4.0 framework. So the recipe is in there. So they're getting speed, they're getting hyper speed, and the key thing that I remember them saying is that they were too fast for the business. The business could not digest and regurgitate and be able to bring to market the kind of capability that they were bringing at that speed. They were too fast. So now the big challenge that Dr. Gatt was talking about was, how do we get the business to be more agile, right? And identifying key things in the business backlog that are of value, that are going to impact the marketplace, because the team was building things faster than the business could identify with it. Let's look at another team. This is an XP team, pair programmers, a company called Follett Software, just outside of Chicago, transforming the organizational, educational marketplace. They're kind of like the Google or the Amazon.com for school systems K through 12 and for university bookstores. Now, you would think that when you pair people and you work in a co-located environment, do you think bugs go down and go up? They go down. And so we wanted to see about the quality patterns, not for Scrum, but for a co-located XP team. And so why would they go down? Why would they go down? Let me just start to get you thinking about this. And I'm going to throw up a picture of a pilot and a co-pilot there. That's my head on the left. Why would they go down? Why do we insist on having 2 pilots in the flight deck on your plane?
Talking out loud.
Huh?
Talking out loud.
Talking out loud. Good. So we call things out. So when I'm flying a plane, I'll be repeating things that I'm hearing with air traffic control. And Jeff on my right there will actually be watching, or listening. Anything else? Why would mistakes go down when you have 2 people?
Continuous quality check.
A continuous quality check. Okay, so it's like an immediate code review. If we're in the software side, you're an immediate code review. What else do you think? Any other ideas?
2 brains are better than 1.
2 brains are better than 1 because sometimes 1 brain gets a little tired. Okay, so just like when you're flying an airplane, every now and then I'll say, hey Jeff, you've got the plane. And he said, my plane. And then he'll begin flying and he'll take care of it and I'll take a break, I'll monitor the radios. So in pair programmers, that's what we do too. All right, while one person is working, the other person is observing, continuous checks. And then when that person gets tired, we'll switch to the other person flying the plane and then the other person will observe. And you find some incredible instant real-time QA going on right there without any testing. Okay, so back in my old career when I worked on the nuclear submarine program, I designed navigation subsystems for the Trident II nuclear submarine. It's just a little boat, 600 feet long, 2 football fields. Just has little things like 24 nuclear missiles on it with 6 warheads in each. And so we were building the navigation systems, the inertial gyroscopes, the sonars, and everything to fly this windowless boat through undersea mountains, caverns, all right, Grand Canyons, deep under the ocean for months at a time. And what do you think would happen if a bug came up on a navigation subsystem with a nuclear submarine? It'd be bad, right? So what we did was we had all of the smartest people that we could muster co-located in one room. We had them working in pairs. We also had tests written before we wrote the code. Writing the test was my job for the entire checkout of the Trident II navigation system for when it has to do things like launch all of its missiles, which you never do. And that's the whole point. The whole point of it is we want to make this such a reliable Death Star that nobody would ever dare to use it, right? And so for 70 years there's been peace in terms of a global world war than you ever saw. And a lot of engineers and scientists on that program were children of World War II. So I just looked around the room and I said, wow, these people's families know war. And so they're actually working to keep peace. And so we were Agile before Agile was cool. And that's what that was some of the key aspects of what we were doing in building code then. Back to today. Okay, this is Follett software. And for a project of their scale, their size of the backlog, the industry average was about 3.5 million to build it. They were doing it in 2.2. Because they weren't using double the head count, the industry average head count was about 35. They were using about 35, okay? But they're using 35 people working co-located in pairs, doing XP. Instead of 12 and a half months, they were doing it in 7.8 months. A full, almost 50% faster schedule, right? Twice the speed. But this is a key thing here. In terms of defects found during QA, 121, which is a full half. So the quality was double, because they had instant code reviews, right? They had people working in pairs, right? Instant QA. So that by the time you get to testing, you really don't have as much defects in the code to test out in the first place. So this is now the edge of the limits of their aircraft, right? So when I talk about, like, well, what's the payoff for doing this sort of thing? I look for $1 million. And typically when an executive says, Michael, we'd like to do a baseline of our organization, we'd like to know the performance numbers of our plane. I'll say, okay, I'm going to do that. And while we're doing that, I'm going to try and find you $1 million. And on this one, I found him $1 million, but I found $1 million times 7. because over the course of a 12-month period, they would typically deliver about 7 systems. And so that found them $7 million. And so their CFO, who was saying, outsource everything to India. So wait a minute, you're already building systems $7 million cheaper than industry average. And maybe if you went off to India, you could do that. But would you be able to have the domain knowledge where you're going to be building systems with only half the bugs? Because your experts here have 10 years or more experiences. So it's not that people in other countries aren't bright. I mean, there are more 4.0 summa cum laude graduate students in China than the entire United States has students. Right? There are smart people in different places. But the thing that we may not have is that they're not sitting next to us. We're not working closely side by side. All right, so I look for $1 million, and I'm going to give away a copy of this paper, How Agile Projects Measure Up, What This Means to You. The 2 case studies in this paper are what I just talked about. And a section of the paper is written by Mike Lunt on the secret sauce. So you can see the early genesis of Dean Leffingwell's SAFe 4.0, all right? Because this was working 10 years ago, all right? So here's a little bit about the secret sauce. So first is buy-in and getting senior level acceptance. And the way you get that is with numbers, it's with facts, it's with data. Because with data comes evidence, with evidence comes belief. Otherwise, it's just my word against yours, and as the saying goes, without metrics, you're just someone with a different opinion, all right? Staying releasable in terms of their iteration demos and nightly builds and frequent code review was a key point of the secret sauce. But this thing, dusk to dawn teamwork, was focused around the communication aspect. So how do you scale high bandwidth communication among 7 parallel teams in 4 different cities? That was the real difficult part, all right? Because knowledge work, software, is about transforming knowledge from someone's brain and putting it into a machine, and that involves communication. The ideal is 2 people sitting together side by side, right? Pilot, co-pilot. But how do you do it when you're talking about people in different time zones in different cities? This was really a key accomplishment, and it showed itself in the defects. Okay, the other thing about the backlog, I talked a lot with Mike Lunt about this. I said, how did you manage all that backlog? And he said, we had to manage the delivery of each of the 7 teams in a master plan of the overall master backlog, and that had to be something we did with a lot of attention. And that's a big part of SAFe 4.0. Okay, so it's the Agile release trains, it's the coordination of the Agile release trains, it's the interplay between the trains, and it's how it scales together when you do it all as one symphony. Okay, you just can't focus on one little thing at a time. You've got to figure out, how do I, like maybe as an air traffic controller, look at 7 planes at once, at the same time, and make sure they don't crash into each other. All right? And then finally, holding back the waterfall, trying to not regress and say, well, we don't really need to do a daily stand-up. Or, well, maybe an iteration retrospective is something we could skip. I mean, you could easily regress and get lazy. And and pilots get lazy too. So you can get your initial training, you can become a certificated private pilot, and then guess where the most dangerous period is for a pilot in terms of crashes? Anyone have any idea how many hours? When it starts to get, the accident statistics actually start to climb? No, not that long. In terms of number of hours, it's at about the 300-hour mark. So now after you've gotten your license and you're flying for 50, 100, 200, 300 hours, we find that accident statistics start to climb among private pilots. That's the window where they start to regress and get lazy. Don't ever get lazy and regress, whether you're flying a plane or you're building code. Okay, so again, pair programmers, this is a summary of Follett, but I've been working with these folks for almost 10 years. So 9 years later, we looked at their data, which I recently presented to their CEO. They have a new CEO. And I said, okay, here's what you were doing 2 years ago. And then I presented what was happening in 2017, 2018. And I'm showing this one in 2015, 2016 because, whoa, wait a minute. Now they were at 1.8 million, no difference in cost, right? But guess what they did? They were building systems that typically had an industry average headcount team size of 15 and using 35. Like, whoa, wait a minute. Now they're suddenly, ramping up with headcount. And so why were they doing that? They were looking to get hyperspeed. Again, they decided to vary the dials. Do we want cost? Do we want speed? And so they said, in this case, we want speed in this market window. We want to fly at the edge of our envelope of the plane. Instead of 9 months time to market, we go on 4.4. Man, that's like double speed. But this is the freaky thing. 40 bugs during QA testing instead of 159, call it 160. So that's 1/4 the number of defects compared to industry average. They are in the upper 75th percentile. So for every 100 bugs that folks out there have to find and fix in QA testing, they only have to find 25. What do you think that does to your delivery time? Shorten it or lengthen it? Shortens it. Because you don't have to spend all that time testing, right? On top of the fact that you're already building fairly clean code from pair programmers. And so now their CEO looked at this data and said, whoa, we have this capability here that's operating at the speed of software sound. And that's what we get from being able to measure and act, measure and act, measure and act, okay? So like 15, 20 years ago when I started getting freaked out about, am I eating right? Am I healthy? My dad died young. What's my cholesterol? What's my blood pressure? Went to my doctor and he said, well, let's get your baseline. And I said, well, you can get your baseline all you want, but I'm a walking dead man. Because my dad died at 39. And his dad died at, not that much longer than that. Maybe 59. So I said, I'm a walking dead man, so no matter what you say, bye-bye, He said, I don't believe that. So we got our baseline numbers, and then we found what would I need to do to move my numbers in the right direction. And so I would do that. Turns out that if you focus on your liver health, which produces 3/4 of your cholesterol, then you're going to focus on your heart health. So you go upstream, and you find out what's the driver of what cholesterol is. The rest is diet. So maybe I should stop eating, double cheeseburgers, right? Or a heavy dairy, meat-based diet. If I want to not pass away early and leave my kids the way my father sadly left his 3 kids. So get your baseline, get your numbers, find out what do you want to dial in. And so we were doing this continuously at Follett every time we measured. Came back with a release retrospective and said, what could we do better? And then we would do it and drive the defects down even further. And so that made the QA team's lives much happier, because they're no longer being kicked as the dogs that's keeping them from delivering, because they're also involved on the front end about how to build code that's going to be clean so that you can minimize the manual testing, right? So this is where QA professionals can shift left and have an impact upstream. And so hold that thought. If you want to read about some of this stuff in Mike Cohn's book, Succeeding with Agile, it's in chapter 1. So in chapter 1, Mike said, hey, I need data. So what do you need? He said, I want to do like case studies, 3, 4, 5 companies. What you got? I said, I have a case study for you, and I'll show you like 50 data points of data. So that's in Succeeding with Agile by Mike Cohn. Now, at one point in the future, after that book was published, Columbus, Ohio, which prided itself as the Silicon Valley of the Midwest, said, we think we have a special community here, and in some cases we're scaling Agile, more than just small pond bridges. All right? One of the organizations in this was one of the largest insurance companies in the United States, and they had an annual budget of $1 billion. Right? I said, geez. Okay, so 7,000 software technology professionals building code, 7 CIOs. Okay? all reporting to one CIO. So we were looking at their data and other companies around the Columbus, Ohio area. And in a nutshell, we found that their defects overall, again, for every 100 defects, they're only seeing 25, all right? In terms of schedule, for every 10 months, they were delivering in 7. That was the overall body. And we also did that in a study in Munich, Germany, and found different numbers. At the time, Munich, Germany was just getting into looking at the quality aspects of Agile. They prided themselves on quality, BMW, Mercedes, German engineering culture. But we found that the American industry was actually ahead, which was interesting. We have taken back the software industry with how we're transforming and scaling how we build software from a quality standpoint. Okay, so let's talk about Agile release trains, because I'm going to give you enough about SAFe, but I'm not going to be talking about SAFe. I want to go beyond SAFe about what SAFe implies. But if you want to read about SAFe, just go to the SAFe, Scaled Agile website, and you can get all the mechanics of that. But I want to talk about, what will we do if we can do SAFe well, and what would it look like? Well, it obviously involves a rather sophisticated coordination effort. We want to be able to look at not just a pond bridge, but the stitching together of the multiple pond bridges to make a big pond bridge. And that takes the ability of doing what-if predictive analysis. So think about when you have path dependencies, 7, say, Scrum teams like BMC software. When one team is done with a certain part of the backlog and you're sequencing the backlog in a certain way, it's going to be very instrumental about how another team sequences their backlog and the interdependencies of that and the scaling of the testing of that. So if you have to be able to test by having B plus C in order to do D or E, you have to be able to plan well. Now this is a really funky thing, because in Agile, we think we don't need to plan. Hashtag no estimate. What the frig is wrong with you people? Of course you have to plan. You have to think about the backlog, and then you have to sequence your backlog. Hashtag no estimate. You guys are crazy. So I'm going to push back on that, because those are the folks that are going to be stuck and they'll never hit the edge of the performance envelope like BMC or Follett software. So we have to be able to look at the epics. We have to be able to break down the epics, and then we have to be able to try to do a war game simulation of scaling this in a larger big picture. And so to predict the future, we have to be able to sometimes maybe use a computer model, because we can't do it all in our head. I can't fly a plane all in my head. Sometimes I need a computer. I need something called Foreflight. I need something that's communicating with the transponder in my instrumentation panel, and that instrumentation panel is hooked up to FAA radar, and I need information, right? I need to be able to do what-ifs, and I need to be able to do some flight planning. So if I'm doing flight planning in a plane, I want to know the performance of my aircraft. So for a Piper PA-28180, a 4-cylinder Cherokee, 4-passenger, what's its fuel burn? What's its cruising speed? Okay. How does it take off and land? What's the landing roll on over a 50-foot obstacle? What's its takeoff roll if I want to get out of a short airfield with trees all around? If I don't know the limits of that plane, I'm going to hit the trees. Okay. What is it with full fuel, with less fuel? With full passengers, with no passengers? Okay. You have to know the numbers of your machine, and you have to be able to plan accordingly. And that same goes for software. So it's not just velocity on your team's sprint or iteration, okay? It's going to be a bigger picture about what you build for the whole backlog. It's going to be about your quality levels. It's going to be about whether you have the right mix of QA versus development professionals in order to be able to finish the testing. So those are the kinds of things that I don't think SAFe completely talks about, but it's behind the scenes. In order to do program increment testing or forecasting and stitching it all together, you have to know the limits of your machine. So a computer might do it like this. I've got a certain amount of story work that I've got to do. I know the performance capabilities of my team for the kind of work that we do. And then I also know the constraints. Maybe I have a headcount limit of 15 people. That's going to be a different speed or velocity than a headcount of 25. The defect levels of a headcount of 15 people might be a different level than the defect levels of a team of 25. So when we run this in a computer simulation, which there are some models that you could look at, commercially available, that do that, you can come up with, computer model simulations about if the backlog is this size, this is when we'll be able to have our release date based on this many sprints. And then I have to string that together with doing the same thing with the second release train, or the third release train, or the fourth release train. And I have to be able to pull it all in one bigger view, okay? So that's what we're talking about, a systems view of our capability, and at the end of the day, you have to know your capability. You have to know the limits of your plane. So if some of you are coming to my workshop on Wednesday, that's what we're going to do. You're going to be able to see how to sketch out what it looks like for your teams. When did you start the story work? What was your head count? When did you begin sprint 1? When did you finish sprint 8? Okay, what was your head count? What was the total size of your backlog? What was the number of bugs that you found during testing? And if you can get that snapshot, you're on the road to being able to look at 2, 3, 4 samples and develop a pattern. When that pattern starts to light up, you're going to start to see your high and low. All right? So I can land my plane in 480 feet, but it's going to vary. It's going to vary on a hot summer day when the air over the wings doesn't create as much lift. It's going to vary on a cold day with low humidity. It's going to vary depending on whether my weight in my plane has the right ballast in the back of the plane, so I'm not nose heavy or tail heavy. All right? And it's going to also vary based on a number of other factors that have to do with where I'm landing. So at sea level, a plane performs differently than at 7,000 feet in the mountains of the Rockies. All right, so you're going to see a range of performance in your team, and you're also going to be able to hedge your bets and never always promise the very edge. Okay, so we're going to do that on Wednesday, and I can teach it to you. So you can do it yourself. All right, so in terms of epics too, we're going to be talking about looking at how epic tracking continues once you begin and as you then are in flight. So it's not good enough just to plan in the beginning, because guess what happens? Things change. So I may take off from an airfield and have all intentions of landing at Martha's Vineyard to go to the beach with my friends, but if I have a certain headwind, or if I have a diversion by air traffic control and they say turn right 20 degrees for traffic sequencing, I'm like, oh man, that's out of my way, I've got to be able to look at what my reforecast is because things have changed. And so now we've got to then be able to quickly re-estimate based on how we're burning down the backlog in epics and stories, and be able to plan accordingly. And manage the backlog. We're managing multiple backlogs in the standpoint of a larger backlog. So we might need to look at our burn up, not only individually, but across the entire portfolio. Okay, I'm going to kind of summarize here and then wrap towards the final stretch, because I'm going to finish early so that I can have as much conversation and dialogue with you, because I'm throwing a bunch of stuff at you. And I'm going to want to say, I don't want to just be the one talking. I want you to talk as well. And let's have a conversation about this. So visualize the portfolio. Look at high-level estimates, stitch them all together. Visualize your velocity and value creation. And I'm going to transition now into not only building what you're building, but what the value of what you're building is. That's where I'm going in terms of a bigger context. And we have to pull it all together as we scale. So if we think about things changing once we get going, think about the fact that the FAA has air traffic control towers, and we'll watch a plane that is already in flight, that's already taken off but hasn't arrived yet. It's going to be really important for you to be able to look at, as your releases are going on this train, looking in real time like radar, about where your journey is, because maybe you diverted, maybe the winds were headwinds or coming from the northwest, and that's kind of like a nose wind toward you. It's going to slow you down on your ground speed. And so like that, we also have models that will look at in-flight measurement, not just at the end of a release, and being able to forecast the rest. That's going to be an important discipline if you're going to be, say, 4.0, as your release trains are already left the station. And it's not going to be some simple math, because if you say, okay, our velocity is this number of story points per sprint, it's not going to be the same in sprint 1, sprint 5 versus sprint 10. It's going to vary. And I'll tell you that it goes in like an S-shaped curve, because in the beginning, the team is just starting to get their rhythm, right? They're going to find stuff that they have to figure out, and they're going to be like, oh, okay, now I got it. And then at some point, they're going to start to gallop and get into a regular cruising speed. I'm mixing horses and airplanes. I'm galloping through the air like Santa's reindeer. And then towards the end, they're going to start tapering off on the actual, stories that they're building, because they're going to start to do testing. So the velocity is going to taper off. So then it's going to be an S-shaped curve. So watch that. At least if you're going to look at your velocity over a period of sprints, assume that it's going to be slower in the beginning, peaking in the middle, and slower at the end, okay? Because if you don't get that things happen in a nonlinear way in this world, you're going to really screw it all up. Okay, so now when we see that there are curves and we can chart and make statistical control-bound charts and predict the future, we found that we could predict, knowing that there are nonlinearities, we could predict an end date to 90% accuracy as early as the first 25% of the build. Like, holy smokes, that's like early warning air traffic control, right? It's not really that complicated to do, but you have to know some basics. But once we do that, and we start hitting our dates and making our commitments, we're like heroes. So you're not the goats that delivered late again, right? You're actually going to be able to achieve what you promised. You're going to have credibility. You're going to build trust among your organization, because what you say you're going to do, you're going to be able to do. And that goes a long way at creating, a sense of appreciation for your team. Because we are like the Rodney Dangerfield of technology. We get no respect. We get no respect because we consistently don't plan and promise well. We have this really dysfunctional thing where we overpromise and then underdeliver instead of underpromising and then overdelivering. I'd rather underpromise and overdeliver, because then I'm a hero, If I overpromise and underdeliver, chances are I just have an inflated sense of my own capability, and that comes from not going to therapy enough. Okay? And just to not divert a lot, most of you probably come from a family where you're the high achiever. Chances are you're probably among the eldest. Okay? So oldest children tend to be the ones that, hey, give it to Mike, he'll fix it. Or give it to Sue. She's the one who's the go-to gal, because she's like the big sister. And so chances are you probably grew up in a pretty dysfunctional family where the children will carry the burden of the family, and you were more likely the older child in the group of your birth order, okay? And so we tend to overpromise and underdeliver. And my then 8-year-old daughter, when she's now 25, she said to me, "Dad, you're always late to pick me up at gymnastics." And I said, "No, I'm not." And she said, "Yes, you are." And I thought about it, and I said, the kid's right, because I'm always packing in more than I can do in a day. And by the time it's time for me to pick up my daughter at gymnastics, I'm 5 or 10 minutes late. And I would think she doesn't notice, but she noticed. And then she didn't trust me, right? She said, "No, you're not going to come when you say you are." So think about that. That comes from an inflated sense of saying, well, we can do it, we can do it. So the can-do mentality of us is sometimes our weakness. So things that Neil Donald Walsh said this in Conversations with God, sometimes our weakness is our strengths turned up too loud. So when I like to be a feeling of a responsible person, sometimes I'm over-responsible, I over-promise, and then I under-deliver. Happens all the time, so that's why it helps to have a sanity check. So run the models, run the forecasts, all right? If you do it, you'll be seen as having this magic wand because you're being able to deliver what you promise. And then, in the wrap-up of this, it really gets good if we say, now we're going to deliver value. So we have this capability of really delivering well, but are we delivering good stuff that's meaningful? So let's talk about that, because this is where I'm going with my clients at the leading edge of their corporate performance. We're talking about, all right, this is what the president said when he looked at our data. And he said, but how do we know we're building the right things? So, well, that's an interesting question. So we are able to build things twice as fast with 1/4 the number of defects. He says, but are we having an impact on the marketplace? Are we having the outcomes that we want in order to achieve what we want as a corporation and self-actualize? And that was a really interesting question. So we said, okay, let's start to do outcomes road mapping. Let's think about what, not only the activities, what we're doing, but what are the desired outcomes that we are seeking in the marketplace. So maybe we're trying to transform the classroom, in Follett's case, of teachers being able to innovatively create educational content that they couldn't do before. That's not just like a story. That's like really impacting how kids learn. All right, so these kinds of outcome visualizations is a different way of looking at, well, what is it you're doing and why are you doing it? Okay, and so what would your desired outcomes be? What are the benefits to the children? What are they going to get from this? All right, how would you map that? Maybe it's just not a roadmap per se or a road to outcomes. Maybe that could be the next conference theme, the road to outcomes. Not just the road to quality, because if you had good quality, but no one gave a crap about what you're building, what good is it? Right, what's the road to outcomes? So this is what we're doing now in getting the business to be agile, to say, how would you index, not just the story points of your stories, but how would you index your outcomes? What would it look like in terms of the value metrics that you're saying we need to have in the marketplace? So we're getting to the point where we're now saying, let's go into the product management team and let's teach them workshops and courses about looking at their backlog, looking at what gets translated to epics, but start having them not put story points on it, but put value points on it. So why would we do that? Because we want to sequence how things go in the parking lot. Okay, we want to move things around and order them for the Agile release train by priority of importance. And not just by, quote, value, but by the outcome that we're seeking to achieve in the marketplace. So at first, I said to some of the organizations I was working with, think about it in terms of increasing or improving revenue. All right, that's the way you get the CEO's attention, because he wants money, right? Must have money. Avoiding costs, the CFO likes that, must reduce costs, right? Improving service, okay, make customers happy, right? So that's another dimension. But when I threw this out there, I got something that came back to me in the case of Follett, for example, that was say, well, let's break it down. Let's grow revenue and reduce costs, and not only improve service, but nurture our customers and make them happy. Which is kind of related to improving service, and have the business scale them on this grin index, 1 to 5, in each of these 4 dimensions. Max score is 20, lowest score is maybe 4, or below 4, and have them communicate that to the engineering team. So they're doing that because ultimately we're trying to answer this question. What's your purpose in this release or in your life? All right. So that's a very interesting question, and I'll say that it's not just what you're doing, but it's your why. Why are you doing this? Okay? What is the point in terms of the meaning behind what you're doing. And so I like to think about it as if in the hierarchy of needs by Maslow, we have our basic psychological needs met, we have our safety met, we feel comfortable in our home, we belong to a team, we have esteem because we're building systems at twice the speed and 1/4 the defects. But then at the top, what's the self-actualization of this organization, of this team? What do you want to be? Okay, so what is your why? And so here's a guy who has an interesting why. You know him, right? What's he got? Car company? He's got a car company, Tesla, right? The new Model 3 is amazing. A friend of mine just picked it up. Okay, he's got SpaceX, all right? He's got solar. But what's his why? Interestingly, this is a quote that I saw. The thought of the human species being wiped out, it's all-consuming. If you've seen the movie Racing Extinction, which is about the 6th mass extinction happening now on Earth, 65 million years ago, an asteroid hit the planet. And we looked at the rate of species extinction. Right now, we're at a massive rate of species extinction today because of human activity. This guy's trying to save the planet. He's really like the real-life Iron Man, you know? And so his why is about trying to preserve life on Earth while he's a car company and a SpaceX guy and a solar panel guy. So think about that in terms of outcomes. His outcome statement has nothing to do with return on investment per se. It's about, I'm trying to extend the quality of life on the planet. So what's your why? And so Follett Software is talking about igniting the flames of knowledge for children. Their why is about transforming learning. They want to be able to change the way children see the world and solve the problems of the world that we're building, that we've created. Some people look at health. They may say, our why is to be able to improve the quality of life or health of people in our population. And so this is an interesting team of people, Alexis and Micah Risk, Alexis Fox, co-CEOs of a company that has just been contracted by a major healthcare provider on the West Coast to help patients who are being discharged from hospitals, say for cancer or heart attacks, on how to transform the way they eat. Because in the philosophy as food is medicine, Dr. Michael Greger, T. Colin Campbell, we find that that food is the cause and also the cure of disease. You can actually reverse heart disease based on how you eat. So we don't just create heart disease from all the Big Macs, but we can actually turn it around. And that was something that you may have found from the work of Dr. Dean Ornish. So when they created their company, they actually discovered, when I was talking with Alexis, she said we had to be a software company. We realized that to do this, we needed to build software. And so this is them in my plane. This is their chief technology officer, Alex Shapov, who's an agilist. And when I talked to Alex about how he's building and scaling his code, he's doing all the things from a standpoint of looking at the bigger picture, creating reusable frames, driving down bug rates, being able to quickly adapt existing code and employ code reuse, to be able to scale their websites so that they can then put it out to other health professionals who will be able to use their food planning technology. They call it the Pandora of food, is what Forbes magazine said. So just like you can pick your Spotify music playlist, this says, I've looked at your profile, how much time you have, what your preferences are, and here's a way that you can eat if you are, say, a cancer survivor. Here's a better way to eat if you're a heart disease survivor. Okay, so that's their why. And another bigger picture as to why is this is the coast of North Carolina after Hurricane Florence. What do you think you see there? What is this shot from NASA? NASA had a satellite image. They took some pictures. This was the visual. This is the infrared. What do you think it is? Coal ash, yeah. A percentage of it. Anything else? Hog wastewater. Smithfield Farms has 90% of the captive animal, confined animal feedlot operations with pig and waste lagoons, and that's all shit and piss, right? just all flowing into the ocean, creating what's called a hypoxic dead zone. And interestingly, when Micah Risk and Alex Shapov and Alexis Fox were talking about the environmental why, is they want to reduce factory farming. If we reduce factory farming, we reduce what's happening on these confined operations, we reduce the pollution on the earth, we reduce the methane emissions in the air, because methane is 23 times as powerful as CO2, and methane emissions right now account for more greenhouse gases than planes, trains, trucks, all the transportation combined. Okay, so when you look at 480 parts per million in terms of greenhouse gases, the biggest one is methane. So if we reduce our animal agriculture, we also not only improve our own health, but the health of the planet. So that's an outcomes roadmap that these two guys are, Sprout Brothers, Sproutman.com. They're creating the ability for people to grow their own food and create the most nutrient-dense food from a sprout that you can then use and eat and be healthier. And I got them to do like a scrum board. Right? So they're doing backlogs in progress, finished, and looking at a safe 4.0 roadmap for growing sprouts and creating green juices. And as we wrap it up, we're really trying to say, well, what's your outcomes roadmap? Maybe we want to be able to reduce our impact on the oceans. Here are coders in something called the Fish Hackathon, where they create self-organizing teams to reduce the impact of global illegal fishing. Another team is using software to curb or curtail or stop the Ebola epidemic. So this was their why. Okay, so this was their purpose. And ultimately, it's about self-actualizing. So in that standpoint, now that I'm kind of wrapped up, I'm going to take it to the home stretch here and say that hope changes everything. And I believe that when we think about scaling what we do, it's also about scaling the outcomes of what we do. And I want us to think about that broader context, because if we can make the business agile and not just being agile, I think QA teams can start with that. I think we can have a greater impact in terms of the meaning of our role in our organization if we start to get the organization speaking not only about quality, but talking about outcomes. So I would encourage you, work with the business. See about when they create a backlog and a demand for things that you ultimately are going to be the final Haynes inspector. They don't say Haynes until I say they say Haynes. Remember that old commercial, right? You folks are the folks at the front line of working with the business. And if you convince your senior leadership that you're going to help the business become agile, you just increase the value of your place in your company. And so with that, I'm going to close with that phrase. So thank you very much. Let's open it up. We finished early. We want to be able to talk about outcomes. We've got about 10 minutes, right? Good. See? Over-promise, right? Under promise and over deliver. Yes, John.
So, years back, I was on a team, early days of Agile, adopted a lot of the Agile ideals, implemented them, even won awards and published on it in the project, this large project. Something I observed after we achieved that, a lot of the key players, and I'm talking like the Scrum Masters, the software program managers, some of the senior people, went on because of success to other places, and the team regressed back to the old ways. Is that something you've seen?
Oh yeah, so we have to talk about institutional knowledge and how we continue it, right? Because if it's only locked up in somebody's brain, and once that brain moves on to the next place, then we have to start over again in many ways. And so this is where enterprise learning starts to become more important, and being able to migrate the knowledge or keep an institutional memory of knowledge. So when we do baselines and we capture practices and we capture data, we know that, first of all, over the 10 years that I've worked with Follett, there's been turnover. But we have all of the information all along over the course of 10 years about what the patterns were and what worked and what didn't work, so that a new person coming in can can acquire that institutional knowledge. I also think that pair programming is an interesting thing because it's about mind melding and taking someone that is got deeper experience in a particular domain and maybe being able to migrate that knowledge like a junior co-pilot or first officer to the next person. And so by pairing, interestingly, we preserve institutional knowledge by kind of like an oral history. So not only do we have written history, which we now have, but we also have an oral history. And also keep that information in a central place and have it be transparent and accessible, because that's kind of like the Google search of your own company's internal practices and capability. You can't just keep it locked up in one person. So if you're going to scale, you got to be able to scale the ability of preserving knowledge. So that's a great question. Thanks. Yes?
Is there a notion of agile customer?
Is there a notion of an agile customer?
We are building code, building faster, we're being agile, business agile.
Yeah.
There's a notion of agile customer. If we keep building all this and if we don't change the customer habits.
Well, that's kind of interesting. You know, I think that you know, we're trying to get the business to be agile in terms of outcomes visioning, and I think that they're the ones who understand the customer. But it'd be interesting to see, how do we get customers to be agile and adaptable? I don't know, maybe we're just trying to follow their lead, you know, in a lot of ways, or maybe leading where others follow. Like, we don't have smartphones because the customer had an idea for a smartphone, you know? I mean, smartphones came out because somebody said, I have a vision for a device that's going to transform society. And I remember talking to Apple about that way back before the phone even existed. They created this thing called the Newton, which was trying to compete against the Palm Pilot. Remember that? And interestingly, at the time, the CEO was John Scully, and I was sitting having lunch with John. This is before Steve Jobs came back and kicked John back out, after John kicked Steve Jobs out. Now you know how old I am. But he said, what we do with outcomes visioning with Apple is we envision what society might be like in the future, a future society. So they're kind of putting themselves as the consumer, as the customer, and being maybe not agile, but in a future state. And then we say, then we envision what that outcome would look like, and then we work backwards. We say, for that to be able to occur, what do we need to occur 4 months before that, and 4 months before that, and 4 months before that, and work our way all the way back to here. And so that, what he's describing is outcome mapping, which is what we're doing with leading edge clients now. So we're getting them to use the mechanics of applying indexing, value indexing, not just story point indexing, but value indexing for the backlog. And if we get the customer involved in that, maybe that's a way of getting the customer to have dialogue with the business about, you know, what do you see in the world? So I think focus groups, marketing groups probably are trying to do stuff like that. It's probably a little far from us removed as a QA professional, but that's a good question. So thank you. Okay, let's keep going. You. Jeremy.
Two different methods of trying to order this. One was by value, and the other was you were saying that we have like different teams who have different needs, and this team is dependent on this thing to be done in order to move forward.
Yeah.
How do you merge those two things? So you have the value proposition, and you have the actual.
So the question, yeah. So the question is about, for those of you who couldn't hear, we talked about two things. The ordering of things among different teams and say different, you know, different trains, right? But also, you know, when you have outcomes and indexing outcomes and value, how do you merge that? It requires a discipline. It requires a practice. It requires an actual way of getting consensus around the organization that says, you own this, so how do you want to make it? So in the case of Follett, we actually created working groups where it wasn't because I thought it was a good idea. I said, here's the idea. What would it look like if you manifested it? And so we got a facilitated session going around where they designed it. And I just kind of scribed it as a secretary. And then once it was scribed, we got them to agree to it. And then once we got them to agree to it, we got them to implement it. And then in terms of looking at the car ahead of the car, like when I taught my kids how to drive, I said, don't look at the car in front of you. I want you to look at the car in front of the car in front of you. That's where we then went to outcomes mapping. and something by a woman named Alexandra Chapman, who came out of the Boston Consulting Group. She and I are teamed now about how to create visioning to pull it all together by creating outcomes visioning, which is what I showed you up there. And that's the car ahead of the car. Now, the last thing I'll say on that, because this could be a really long answer, is that you probably have heard research that we only use a certain percentage of our brain, right, in conscious thinking, and that there's an actual tapping of knowledge that we can access in deeper states of awareness and thought. And a lot of people who teach meditation actually believe this. So how do you do that? We've created an idea called engineered thinking. How do you acquire knowledge from the mind in a way that's most effective? Believe it or not, it's not with a laptop, it's not with a cell phone. It's about writing things down. It's about being able to access when you're in, say, a semi-dream state. I get my best ideas in the shower, you know? I'm kind of lathering up like, I just came up with an idea, right? I put a recorder by my bed because I sometimes wake up in the middle of the night, and before I'm awake and I forget what that dream was, I'll record it. And so how would you stitch this all together, I think, comes in terms of a creative process of engineering your thinking. So I'm going to put that seed out because it's not easy, but it also requires some discipline. It requires a definitive practice. How are we doing on time?
We're good. We've got room for a couple more questions, about 2-3 more minutes.
Room for a couple more questions. Wow, so I started off with like a laptop not working, and we're still able to get your questions. Thanks. We got one there, and we got one there, and one there. So let's try to get those 3 at least. So let's start with you, and then we'll go to you. Okay, great. Say your name.
I'm Greg.
Hi, Greg.
So we implemented SAFE a couple years ago. It's working great in some regards, not in others. The big room plan that SAFE requires became a waterfall.
Interesting.
Yeah. So sprints are agile, stories are agile, but if you choose to go in a direction that you didn't put down the big room plan,
Yeah.
there's a crisis.
Okay.
How do you be agile within the iteration?
Yeah, so the question was, it became waterfall-y, right, as you implemented SAFE. So what would you say you mean by that? Let me just tease that out. Did it become like...
The stories that were put on the board for big room planning became the waterfall.
Okay. So they became...
As you implement, you realize that's not exactly what you need, but it becomes a commitment.
Yeah. Okay, so it becomes a commitment, or it becomes inflexible or unadaptable. Okay, so how do you, that's a good question. I actually don't have the answer to that. How do you have a culture realize that it needs to be adaptable even while it's doing a scaled agile? Yeah, I'd say it's a culture. I'd say it's a cultural issue that we'd have to address with leadership, and say, how locked in are you on this? I would then connect it to what I said here in terms of saying, is that outcome, if you did an outcomes road mapping about why that story had to exist, what's the why behind the outcome? And maybe see whether or not that's rigid or can be flexible. Like, is there another way? Because one of the things that Alex Chapman and I talked about in terms of outcomes and outcomes road mapping, she says, I don't want to use road mapping. It implies there's only one road. There could be more than one way to get the outcome. So we have to look at mapping because there's multiple ways about it. So I'd say, for starters, I'd get an outcomes road mapping mindset in there and start to think about, is this the only way to get your outcome? Like, this is your what, but what's your why? Does that help? Okay. Probably a lot more about that, and grab me offline. And any of you who don't get to ask your question, I'm sticking around for the whole 3 days. Just grab me, One there, and then one there, and then I think we're going to wrap up on time. Yeah?
Very quick question. Is it possible to do pair programming when you're not co-located? You have teams in Southern California and teams in Oregon and working out.
So is the question, is it possible to do pair programming when you're not co-located?
Yes.
No. It's a different thing, but it's not pairing.
Correct.
It's a different thing. I think it's collaborating, but it's not pair programming. Pair programming requires like really having the physical energy of sharing the same physical space. And the one thing about being in the same physical space is you communicate with vibes, you know, and you communicate with a certain kind of nonverbal communication that also creates trust. So if I'm flying a plane with my buddy Jeff and we're pilot and co-pilot, there's a certain kind of communication here that sometimes he doesn't even have to say anything. Like he'll just say, I just changed your radio frequency, you're off by 1 digit. Like, oh, that's why air traffic control wasn't answering, you know, or something like that. And that same shared physical space. Tom DeMarco, one of my great mentors, also said that when you work closely next to somebody, you can create that magic of trust, which means you'll go the extra mile because you're looking out for her back or she's looking out for your back. And that's something that happens with sharing physical space. Pairing in non-physical space is a different thing, but it's not pairing. Great. Last one?
So when you talk about these companies practicing pair programming, are they doing that full time, having 2 engineers assigned to each other working on the same code year-round?
Yeah, so the question is, when you're talking about people doing pairing, are they doing that full time, and is that like year-round? No. There are times that they've actually said, in this particular case, we're going to not work in pairs, and sometimes we're going to work in pairs, and we get to see what the different kinds of results are from the measurements. So in the Follett case, they worked in one case where they broke the pairing model, and they used a Mongolian horde, and they used contractors like crazy to try to jam the date. Guess what happened? Their defect rates. Woo! Right? So we said, you're knowingly doing that. And because there was a legal case around it, because they had to be able to create a certain capability to avoid a lawsuit or help, you know, mitigate the risk for a lawsuit for a school system, protecting the client from litigation or something like that. And they said, you know, we know we're doing this. And so that required a different shift in the number of QA versus developer mixes. So, you know, things have consequences, just anticipate them and deal with it. But quick answer is, it's like a something that you apply, and you may not do it 100% of the time.
Outstanding.
Whoa.
Michael does not disappoint.
You guys are great. Thank you. Great questions. Appreciate it. Have a great conference.